Welcome to part 4 of our dramatic beauty portrait tutorial retouch. This is possibly the most important part to a successful beauty retouch, the negative dodge and burn. And before I get into this, I want to give props to the person where I first heard this term from, negative dodge and burn, fellow retoucher Pratik Nayak. Now, I have been using this part as my workflow, or this step in my workflow for a while, but hearing it called negative dodge and burn really changed how I approached this step and how I thought of it. I think in general, when we first learn how to dodge and burn, we do everything at once. So we're mostly trying to add contrast. We might be trying to reshape or recontour our subject. But when we learn how to use our negative dodge and burn and start using our dodge and burn to help us with transitional values, it really increases the quality of our retouch. Because not only is our dodge and burn step stronger, but then our frequency separation doesn't have to do as much work. So it all ties in together. So let's look at first how I'm going to do my dodge and burn. There's a couple of methods that I think are really strong quality methods. I think if you're going to use the gray layer method where you're painting with black and white to darken and lighten your image, I think that's a great non-destructive method. The way that I generally do things is with a curves layer. So I'm going to show you how I manually set that up. I'm going to use an adjustment layer. So I'll scroll down to my adjustment layer icon here, click on curves. And so if I'm going to dodge, I'm just going to select here in the middle, pull up just a little bit, okay, and I'm going to hit Command I. What Command I is a shortcut for inverting my selection. So this selection is all white, so when you invert it, it becomes black, so we don't see it in the layer mask. And I'll label this so I know which one's which, so I don't forget later, dodge. And then I'll do the same thing for my burn. So adjustment layer, curves, select somewhere in the middle, pull down just a little bit, hit Command I to invert that, and now I have my setup. Now let's label this burn. Another thing I like to do is to use my groups, so I'm going to shift click on both of these, hit Command G so that I have a D&B group. You can label that D&B or whatever you want, so I know that it's dodge and burn. Now, another thing that I'll do sometimes is create a bunch of copies right away, because I know that I'm not going to try to do this with one step, with one dodge and burn. I like to build so that way it's even less destructive as I go. If I go too far, if I really don't like what I've done, I can just delete one of the groups. And so if you want to create a copy, all you have to do is hit Command J, and you'll see D&B copy. You can create as many as you want. I usually create a whole bunch. Turn all these off, and then just worry about this guy. I'm going to delete these just for now. Alright, and let me show you how I actually work in my dodge and burn. So let's go to dodge, which is where I do most of my work. Grab my paintbrush. I want to have a soft brush here. So somewhere between 0 and probably 10% is where I usually am. I do like to work with a softer brush when I'm dodging and burning. Another tip here is that if I hold down Control and Option, I can drag right to make my brush larger and left to make my brush smaller while using my Wacom tablet. You can also affect your hardness by dragging up and down. So it's a really nice shortcut, especially if you're using a tablet. The other thing here is I want to paint with white and black. So if, for instance, you had some colors selected and you just want to go back to the defaults, then you can hit D for default, which will give you black and white. And then you can hit X on your keyboard to toggle in between black and white. So if I hit X, you can see now my foreground color is white. When I hit X again, now it's black. And so that's really useful as I'm painting. If I go too far, so let's say I'm dodging here, and let's turn up the opacity so we can see what happens. Okay, see if we can see that. So you see that dodge? Now if I went too far, I can just hit X, and I can bring that back down without having to undo everything or Command Z. I can just have some control over how much I remove. So maybe you don't want to remove everything, you just want to pull back a little bit. Now another tip here is I'm going to hit Command Delete to fill with my background layer. Alright, so that way I can just kind of restart. So now let's talk about the methodology of what we're actually trying to accomplish and what we mean by negative dodge and burn. So I'm going to turn on my helper layer, which just allows me to see a little bit better. And let's look at our other image as well. It already has our helper layer. and I have some dodge and burn actions. Help me save some time. Alright, so I'm trying to remove. So for instance, right here, this shadow, which is a necessary shadow, is just a little bit darker than everything else, so it stands out. So if I go to my dodge, I have my white brush, and I zoom in. I'm going to put my opacity at 100%. I'm going to start my flow at 2% and see how that goes. If it builds too quickly, then I'll pull that down. And I'm just going to paint in here. Just trying to pull this down. I'm not trying to get it completely rid of it right now. I just want to make it not as dramatic. Okay, now let's zoom back out. Now if I hit Command Z to undo, you guys can see kind of a visual representation what we mean by a negative dodge and burn. This is what was there, and we're just trying to pull things down and remove things that are a little bit distracting. So I might want to bring this down a little bit. Command Z just to check that out. When you're learning, I still do this, but especially when you're learning, I recommend that as you go, hit Command Z, undo and redo, just to make sure that it feels like you're removing something and not creating something. Because if you go too far, it'll feel like you're adding a highlight or a shadow to your image instead of removing a highlight and shadow. The other tip that I would highly recommend you guys as you're working with your dodge and burn is to work on different levels or visual vantage points. So if I'm only dodge and burning from, say, this zoomed in view, when I zoom out, I'm definitely still going to see things that I've missed. So you want to work from a zoomed out vantage point where you'll see some of these larger areas. All right, and then you want to zoom in to kind of a middle ground where you might see some of these guys here. So I can see that this is a little bit darker. I can see this little guy right here is a little bit darker, that sort of thing. And then I want to get even tighter just to kind of check to see what else I need to do. Especially when we have things like little hairs. Because when I zoom out here, what I'm going to see is something that is dark and then light and then dark. And you may want to dodge and then burn and then dodge, or as you zoom in you might actually see that, well, I might prefer to deal with this as texture, or I might prefer to just burn down this hair a little bit and then go from there. So you want to zoom in, zoom out as you're working. Okay, so that's basically it. There, in terms of the technique, there isn't that much to it. Really what comes into play is choosing specifically what you want to work on, and not choosing things that you shouldn't be dodging, and choosing things that you should be dodging. So this shadow, for instance, is distracting. This darker area here is actually defining the shape of my model's face. So if I were to say dodge this completely, and let's do that so you guys can see what happens, what I would wind up doing is completely flattening her out. And I would lose a lot of the structure that makes up her face. So what you can see is happening now is that instead of this making it look like this is higher, lower, higher, it starts to become just one plane. And she really loses the characteristics that define who she is. So you can see before and after. Really flattens her out. So knowing what you should be affecting and what you shouldn't be affecting are really the keys here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and fast forward as I go through my dodge and burn. Okay, so I think that's a good stopping point for now. There's still some work that needs to be done. Part of this process is the more you do, the more you see that you need to do, and really what you're doing is removing the things that are more visible. And as you remove those distractions, other things that you didn't see that weren't as distracting become more apparent to you. And part of this process too is as you work, you may not feel like you're doing a whole lot, but then as you toggle on and off, so here's without our dodge and bone so far, and here's with, so without, with, without, with. And you can see also keeping in with the name negative dodge and burn that we feel like we're taking things away and not adding to our image, right? So before and after. Without my helper layer, again, so before and after, before and after. In the next step, step 5, I'll show you guys the steps that I took for my black and white conversion for this set of images.